Okay, let's put what we learned about if statements in practice and check if the user put a value for the interface and for the MAC address. Now from before, we know that the options variable in here contains the values for the interface and for the MAC address. So all we have to do is check if options.interface and options.newMac contain values. We're gonna have to do this check in here because the options is being captured in here. I don't really like to do that because we have a getArguments function and we should do everything that's related to the arguments within this function. That's why what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna revert back to something that we had before when we actually used to capture the arguments in here. And what we're doing now is very similar to what we were doing before. We're initializing the options and the arguments with whatever is being returned from the parser and parse args. So the options is going to contain the values entered by the user, and the arguments is going to contain the arguments entered by the user. Now, we're going to use our if statement after that. So, following the syntax that I showed you in the previous lecture, we have to do first, do the if statement, followed by the condition. And like I said, there is a large number of ways to write conditions. We can compare values. For example, if we have variables, we can check if x is equal to 1, for example. We can check if something is greater than something, if something is smaller than something, if a list contains an element, and so on. In today's lecture, we're going to use something that's relevant to our goal, and we want to check if options contains a value for the interface and if it contains a value for the MAC address. So our first condition is going to be if options.interface. That's all we have to do. So all we're saying is if options.interface, then we put the colon and then we can execute code. And as you can see, automatically PyCharm has indented the space for us, and it's allowing us to write code in here, which means this block of code will only be executed if this condition is true. And our condition is if options.interface. So if options.interface holds a value. Now, if you think of it, we don't want to check if options.interface holds a value. We want to check if it does not hold a value, then we want to show an error. So what we're going to do is we're going to do if not options.interface, then we're going to write code to handle error. Now I'm putting this as a comment because I want to get back to it later. Now the next thing that we want to do is to check if the user entered a value for the MAC address. Now we can do this using the elif or using another if statement. In our example, it doesn't really matter which one we use because we're going to exit in the first condition if the user did not put a value for the interface. But I'm going to go with elif, which is short for else if, and we're going to say again, if not, options.newMac. And again, in here, we're going to execute code to handle error. Okay, now I didn't put any code in here because I want to have a quick look on the if statements and then we'll put our code. So what we're doing now is we're checking if not options.interface. So if the user did not put a value for the interface, then we want to display an error, an exit. If they did, then we're going to move to the next check and we'll check if they did not enter a value for the new MAC. If they didn't, then we'll also print an error and exit. Now you can just use a normal print statement and then use an exit statement in Python to exit. Or we can actually use the parser object to handle this for us. Because remember when we created the parser object here, we said this is an entity or a person that knows everything about parsing and can handle all aspects of parsing. So we can just do parser.error, and what this will do, as you can see, it's already shown us how to use it. it'll basically display the message that we put and exit. So the message that we're gonna display to the person is gonna say, please specify an interface, use -- help for more info. And again, we're gonna use a similar instruction for this one. The only difference is we're gonna say, please specify a MAC, use -- help for info. Now, this is all good. One thing that we haven't done so far is handle the code after the if statement. So after this if statement, if we reach this line 16, that means the user put an interface and put a new MAC. So we should be able to change the MAC for them. So all we have to do at this point is return options. And I chose to return options because we never use the arguments in our program, so it makes sense to just return the options from the get arguments in here. And then when we're calling get arguments here, we have to capture the value of options, and I'm just going to create another variable and I'm going to call it options. And that's it. Now let's have a quick look at our program. Up to this line, we know that options and arguments will contain the arguments and the values returned by parser.parseArgs, which is the values and the arguments entered by the user. Then we're using an if statement. In the first condition, we're checking if the interface is not set. If it's not set, then we're going to display please specify an interface and then exit the program. If it is set, then this condition is false. We're going to go to the next condition and we're going to check if the options.newMac is set. If it's not set, then we're going to display all of this and exit. So if we reach this line and we didn't exit the program, then that means we have an interface and we have a new MAC. The variable that holds the interface and the new MAC is the options, so we can just return that. We're capturing this in here where we are calling the get arguments, and then we're using options.interface and options.newMac in the change MAC, which will execute all of this and change the MAC address for me. Now let's go and run this program and see how it's gonna handle the errors. So first of all, let's run it without a MAC address. And as you can see, it's given us the usage and it's given us the error message that we specified saying please specify a new MAC, use help for more info. Now let's try to give it a MAC but not give it an interface. And again, we get an error message telling us please specify an interface. Now if we run the program properly, just to make sure that it works, and this time let's change the MAC address to something that ends with 11, hit enter, we get a proper print statement, and if we do ifconfig eth0, you'll see that the MAC address did change to the MAC address that we want. So that's it for now. Quick example of using an if statement. I highly recommend spending some time experimenting with different types and different styles of if statements, something similar to what I showed you in the previous lecture, just to get more comfortable with it. We're going to be using this a lot throughout the course. We're going to be using a lot of if statements. We're going to be using a lot of conditions. So using this is going to become very easy for you anyway.